Hello, good evening, and welcome to the TNT Show. This is our 194th show, and as you know, most times when we all get together like this at 7 o'clock live on a Wednesday, I talk about this being a great day for British democracy. Several people have pointed out to me that the expression British democracy is an oxymoron, but enough of that. We're going to change things a little bit tonight. We're going to talk about perhaps the wider area to begin with. You probably noticed that tonight the BBC has described a video shared by President Trump on Gaza as offensive. So far, it's the only thing the BBC has found to be offensive about Gaza, which is an interesting situation. And also tonight, before the show started, I managed to catch a glimpse of President Macron of France being interviewed on Fox News, which is probably further to the right than GB News, which again is saying something. We're down to minutiae of measurement now here, perhaps. And he told them categorically that this was close to being the anniversary of the time when Russia invaded Ukraine. As you know, that's pretty much a blasphemy as far as President Trump is concerned, who regards the matter as being conducted the other way around. It was interesting that Fox didn't go blank at that point, but they persisted with the discussion, which is always good to hear. We presumably also noticed that the French Parliament has decided that they voted, in fact, to put higher taxes on high earners in order to augment the budget in France. Of course, in the UK, it's almost exactly the opposite. The decision is taken to avoid taxing high earners, in fact, but to tax people who perhaps can least afford it, which is a peculiar stance one might have thought from a so-called Labour government. But there you are. That position seems to have been set in stone now. So we'll need to watch with keen interest when the next election comes up. And the Labour Party in Scotland in particular seeks to defend this position. I think that might be quite a challenge. But who knows? Voters are fickle and sometimes change their minds. It's a great pleasure tonight to welcome our guest. And he needs no introduction. Tonight we'll be talking to Kenny MacAskill. Kenny, how are you?
I'm very well, thank you. Pleasure to be back.
Good to talk to you. Now, we were talking earlier before we went on air about Grangemouth, and I think you're planning to be at the Grangemouth demonstration on March the 1st.
No, I'll be at the Alba NEC. I won't be at the demonstration. I'm in regular communication with both Unite, but especially the Shop Stewards Committee, who are continuing to maintain the fight because this is calamitous for Scotland, and the proposals by both the Scottish Government and the UK Government are entirely inadequate for the scale of what we face.
How do you think it's going to work out?
Well, we just don't know. I think the real tragedy at the present moment, John, is the sanguinity that this closure is being met with. Back in the 80s in the miners' strike, there was at least a fight. In Ravenscraig, there was opposition.
Yeah.
The great tragedy about Grangemouth is, other than the Shop Stewards and Unite, the political leadership in Scotland, with a few honourable exceptions, has wrung their hands and failed to do anything. And yet this is utterly catastrophic, not just for the workers who are losing their jobs, for tens of thousands of workers, and for Scotland as an industrial nation.
But I thought the Labour leadership, Keir Starmer, said this week he was going to find hundreds of millions of pounds to support Grangemouth.
Well, first of all, we can't afford it to close. If it closes, there is a significant problem. It's not just a couple of hundred jobs. At the end of the day, it will end up with 300, 400, 500 jobs. But that's only for those who are on the payroll. There are contractors, several thousand, who rest on getting work there. Their work will go. So it's not, a few hundred, it's thousands. And then you've got all the businesses located close by. You've got the supply chain. You've got everything that integrates into the economy. So the knock-on effects for Scotland will be calamitous. And it's not just for this generation, it's for future generations. I grew up when it was the BP and ICI, not INEOS. The kids from Linlithgow didn't, just go to St Andrews like Alec or Edinburgh University like myself. Those that didn't go to university, many of them went and got an apprenticeship. And if you speak to Robert Burns, who was in charge of Scottish engineering and apprenticeships there, the number of youngsters who got a training at Grangemouth is not 1,000 or 2,000, it's over 10,000.
Yeah.
And so, if we then decide that Project Willow is going to come to fruition, and everybody recognises that we do have to transition, nobody's arguing that shouldn't happen. But where are these skilled workers going to come from? Because these young men and women will be off. I've spoken to workers at the present moment who have been tapped by the UAE or Saudi Arabia, offered 100,000 tax-free to move there. Others are contemplating going to Canada. So if we do go down the new path, the renewables that both Miliband and John Swinney are talking about, who's going to be there to staff it? Because these youngsters can't twiddle their thumbs. They need a job, and there isn't going to be a job for their skill in Scotland. So that is why it has been disgraceful that there hasn't been a bigger fight put up.
Wasn't the time to fight, though, when there was a change of ownership, where some guarantees might have been exacted? Because this is exactly where you end up in any capitalist system. In order to maximise profits on behalf of the shareholders, decisions are taken to close plants all across the place. Nothing unusual about that.
Absolutely, but usually what you do is you try and object, and that's when, to be fair, when Alex Salmond was in administration, twice INEOS and Jim Ratcliffe sought to close it, and twice he ensured that it stayed open. What we've seen here is that 2 years ago, Michael Matheson was told of plans to close it and seemed to have buried it. For what reason Michael did that, I have no idea, but that should have been the alarm bells, and steps should have been taken. Ed Miliband has obviously been very keen to up his green credentials. How that will square with Heidi Alexander announcing Gatwick and Rachel Reeves promoting Heathrow, who knows? But he's already decided that it'll look good in his green credentials if Grangemouth closes. So you expected that there. But the Scottish Government has frankly been limp-wristed and utterly pathetic. At the very outset of the announcement of the closure, they simply seem to accept the evidence being put forward by the company that the plant didn't make a profit. That's just not true. The plant did make a profit. It does make a profit, as the accounts show. Not as much as INEOS would like, but it makes a profit. With a modest bit of investment, it would make more profit. So that's why the mantra has always been invest, extend, transition. Because if you're going to transition, you've got to extend it to actually have a plant that you can transition. The problem for the Scottish Government is that they simply accepted the spin from the INEOS that it wasn't making any money, didn't put up a fight, went away and just decided that it was closing, the same as they were happy to shut down the North Sea, and it's going to be catastrophic. But the fight doesn't need to be given up. The fight has to continue, and I hope Unite and the shop stewards will continue to do that.
It's an interesting situation when you talk about profits in subsidiaries in multinational corporations. I mean, I worked a lot at the senior level of multinational corporations. I have to tell you that you can adjust any profit statement in a subsidiary. I mean, it's done through transfer pricing. I mean, it's so simple and straightforward. It's even more straightforward than the way that the Scottish budget is worked out in GERS. It's so simple and straightforward. You simply, at a stroke, change how much things cost. And as soon as you do that, it doesn't matter how much money you earn, you can say, look, the costs have risen, it's no longer competitive, therefore we need to move. Simple, end of story. The only way you can deal with that is to say, historically, this is where things were, these additional costs, it'd be useful to know where they came from, etc., etc. But if you don't do that, you have to be assiduous about it. You can't just say at the last minute, oh, I'd like to see the books, because they're not going to give you the books for a start. And even if you got any books, they wouldn't be worthwhile, I should imagine, in terms of testing the hypothesis that it's making a loss.
I mean, it's not just the economic case. You have a UK government that's prepared to extend 600 million in assurances to INEOS for Antwerp. At very minimum, they're only offering for Grangemouth 200, and that's conditional on 3 times that being max levered in from the private sector. At very minimum, pressure should be put upon Labour to say, if you can go 600 million to Antwerp, then you can go 600 million to Grangemouth. Even a modest element, 40, 30, 20 million would actually extend the profitability, increase the profitability of the plant, extend its lifeline and take it from there. So it's not just the economic argument. You have the energy security. We're coming into a very scary time in the world. You're now going to be dependent upon oil imports. It's not just every airport in Scotland is supplied by Grangemouth. Newcastle in the north of England is supplied. And if you speak to the CEOs of the airports, they don't know where their fuel's going to come from. When you'll end up with more Russian fuel. And the tragedy is that this isn't environmentally friendly. Whatever the Green Party may have thought in the past, this will be environmentally damaging, because the environmental emissions that will be reduced by a refinery shutting will be offset by shipping tankers coming in the Forth and the Clyde that will have far more emissions, because the number of ships will increase exponentially. Yeah. Because Grangemouth is going to continue to be just a glorified petrol station. There will be two major pipelines coming in. The Forties field that brings oil from the northeast of Scotland down to Grangemouth will continue to flow. It will be picked up in ships and taken away to the continent to be refined. And instead, we'll be importing other ships to bring it in. And equally, there's another pipeline from Finnart in the Clyde that comes into Grangemouth. And that will see increased shipping coming into Finnart on the Clyde, bringing in fuel that has been refined rather than being refined at Grangemouth, and it will be piped across. So on both the Bonnie Banks and indeed in the Firth of Forth, we're going to see super tankings coming in, spewing out emissions, causing great danger to our environment. So there's no environmental benefit, it undermines your security, and it is catastrophic to our economy.
Yeah, I think you make a good point there. I saw a study, I think it was about 10 years ago, in which the largest pollution element in California is not on land. In fact, it's caused by the ships coming in, the container ships coming in from China, who have to queue up in order to use the Californian ports. And what they do is they dump a lot of stuff that they're not using, and it just washes onto the beaches. So, there's a lot of evidence to support what you just said there, that you're actually inviting more pollution than you're actually getting rid of it. But here we have a situation. But let me go back on one other thing you mentioned, if I may. This business about runways in the southeast. This is an old chestnut, as you know. But every incoming government raises this as an issue, mainly because the lobbyists have managed to catch the ear of the minister, and it always ends the same way, as you know. There's a public inquiry, which has followed on the heels of a previous public inquiry, and the end result is that it's not going to happen. So the likelihood that there will never be a new runway in Heathrow, and it's just as unlikely that there'll be a new one in Gatwick. There may be a modification to one that already exists, but that's a very different thing entirely. So that way, Miliband escapes the inevitable criticism. But yes, other issues. Sure.
Yeah. And we all know that, the flight time as a crow flies, down to London from Edinburgh, Glasgow is about 40 minutes. But you have to burrow around London, for about 15 minutes waiting on a landing slot coming up. What we require in Scotland is less red-eye flights down to London, more direct flights from Scotland, because that would reduce aviation emissions by avoiding you having to take two flights. And indeed, improving the rail network, as the European continent has done. Instead, we're left with a East Coast line that is very good and a West Coast line that's pretty catastrophic.
Yeah, it's pretty good, but it doesn't even begin to compare with, say, Spain. You can travel from Malaga to Madrid at 150 kilometers an hour. And the most recent, listen to this, folks are never going to believe this, but it's absolutely true. A new provider came onto the line, and they are offering that trip for €9. I mean, you have to say to yourself, if these folks can, I know it's only promotional, and I know the €9 will disappear within a couple of days, but the fact that they could afford to do that, even at the beginning, is extraordinary. And they're sharing the line with other competitors, and yet they can still provide a service and know that despite the competition, they can make a profit. It's extraordinary. But then again, Spain built these lines when the UK was still fooling around about privatizing and all the rest of that stuff. Crazy.
Well, I did the Interrail in the late 70s when Spanish rail was appalling. Having been on Spanish rail recently as yourself, the transformation is remarkable. The high-speed line, and I've travelled on the high-speed rail line from Barcelona to Madrid. When you compare that in the distance and time, it's night and day. And as you say, the cost. I mean, I travelled continually by train from Dunbar to London. But for ordinary people who was not being paid by parliamentary expenses, it's too expensive, and they're forced to fly.
Yeah, and it's not terribly good, I have to say, when you compare it with the continent. You don't get the speeds, you don't get the service. I mean, I don't know. To me, but it all stems from a political decision. Somebody in Madrid said, something, we're going to spend public money on this.
Yeah, and Thatcher hated rail. I mean, I have to say, occasionally there's sometimes difficulties on the line. I remember getting off and going on, Midlands Rail or whatever. I mean, people might complain, and I certainly complain about the cost of ScotRail, but the service in Scotland is remarkable in comparison to what people put up with down in the Midlands. And I remember a train out to the Working Class Museum Library in Salford, and frankly, you could have opened the train with a screwdriver, and it really was something from the 1950s.
Yeah. Well, despite all the money spent on the tube system in London, I used to use it all the time going in from Berkshire into the city, and it was pretty horrible stuff, really. It's just I was amazed that things ran even remotely on time because of the volume and because of the lack of investment.
But the Elizabeth line, has taken in huge amounts, so the tube line has been remarkably improved. It's those poor people having to commute in from outside and those in Northern England who are really suffering and struggling. They've been forgotten.
But we're back to what is the root cause? The root cause is not lack of investment necessarily in the railways. It's why you need that investment. The reason for that is because of the gross centralisation in the UK. I mean, if we had an arrangement in the UK which was similar to other countries, where there's a conscious and a real determined effort to make sure that nothing is added to the centralised arrangements that already exist, and steps are taken to decentralise, it just never works because all the decision takers are based in one spot. And as long as you have that, you're never going to be able to decentralise it, I suspect.
Well, absolutely. That's why, Eurostar was originally to be able to see you go from Edinburgh and Glasgow overnight and wake up in Paris. And then that was abandoned. Now you have to go to London. HS2 was to come to Scotland, and then it was abandoned. Now it's been abandoned in full. So, no, they can't see beyond the Watford Gap, as used to be said.
Yeah, that seems to be the case. So let's talk about something else. I want to talk about Donald Trump in a second, because I know lots of people are concerned or worried or interested in what's happening in the US, and it's hard for us to ignore it. But before then, tell us a little bit about your political ambitions. You're running for leader, is that right?
Yes, I'm running for leader of the Alba Party. It's not a position I ever sought, but the tragedy of Alex Salmond's passing has, required me to step up to steady the ship. And I think what I now wish to do is to deliver his dream. And I think the position I'm putting out is that Alec was actually strategically correct in 2021. I think what I'm putting forward is there's two things. One, you need to have a plebiscite election. A referendum has been refused. Asking for a Section 30 order, going cap in hand yet again to London, is a waste of time. So what you have to do is to turn every election into a plebiscite election. The closest election coming up is 2026. And my position is that the Alba Party will stand on the basis that a vote for Alba is a vote for independence. If we get a majority of votes, then that is a vote for independence, and Scotland can act accordingly and seek to negotiate. Equally, what we also have to remember is that, how do you get there? Then there's two aspects to that. One is correctly argued that, list vote SNP, 1 and 2 would be a waste of vote. That was opposed, partly COVID. Secondly, people didn't understand the voting procedure. And thirdly, it was vehemently opposed by Nicola Sturgeon, who argued both votes SNP, despite knowing what the outcome would be, which would be to hand list seats to unionist parties or to, genuflect towards SNP Green. And we had the disaster of the Butte House Agreement. So Alec's strategy was right, but the timing was wrong. Sometimes in elections you can just get it plain wrong. Sometimes you can get it right, but the timing's just not there. And that's what happened in 2021. I think in 2026, the strategy has to be the same, but the timing will be different. I think people now know that both votes SNP is simply going to hand seats to the unionists. And if you want to maximise the vote for independence, then you have to vote for an independent supporting party. And Alba will be saying it's, list vote Alba, Alba for independence, and that's what we'll be putting forward. And the only final point I would make, John, on that is we have to make independence relevant. Because, chatting away to the shop stewards, for example, at Grangemouth, the problem is people believe in independence. That's shown in opinion polls, 48, 52%. But it's like, would you like a good summer? Absolutely. Do you think it's going to happen? No. Do you want Scotland to qualify for the World Cup? Definitely. Do you think it's going to happen? Probably not. And the problem is that people don't see independence. They don't see how we're going to get there, which is why you have the strategy of a plebiscite election. But you've also got it put in the context of why you need it. Because going back to the shop stewards, every one of them would have voted yes in 2014. Some of them were very active. Equally, at the present moment, chatting away with them, they'll just say, but it's not on the agenda. What we've got to say is to point out that we have the perversity, and nothing makes a case for independence more than an energy-rich country where half of its people are in fuel poverty, where turbines turn on land and on sea, and people can't turn on the heating, and yet we're also an oil-producing nation, still one of the world's major oil-producing nations, and we're going to be the only major oil-producing nation without a refinery capacity. And finally, at a time when the United Kingdom and the USA are carving up the world, we'll be encouraging Syria, who have less oil than us, to drill, baby, drill and burn it, and Syria will have a refinery capacity despite being a country that has come out of a civil war and been engaged in war for a decade or more. That's perverse.
It does sound perverse. But surely you have a problem. You're languishing in the polls just now, Kenny. I mean, I know that's not under your leadership, but the previous leader was a very, as you say, inestimable presence. And yet, Alba is sitting, 2 or 3% in the polls?
Well,
how do you get from 2 or 3% to...
We have had polls that are showing us registering and winning list seats, and I think we can get there. The problem with Alba has been is people agree with what we're saying. They just don't know about us, but that's beginning to change. We've had publicity because of the leadership election. We've had some publicity because of internal difficulties that we probably wish we hadn't, but it's also people remember the name. And I think, by the time we get to 2026, those who support independence will realise that SNP 1 and 2 is simply going to result in Labour, Tory and Reform being returned on the list. And if you want to maximise the vote for independence, and we need it, because, the refinery is shutting, our people are freezing, lives are being lost, young people are emigrating, then we've got to go for independence. Alba's got the strategy, and we're making the relevant context.
Let's say we're going to wave a magic wand here. It's just after the election in 2026. And let's say, for example, let's say for discussion, you've got 20 MSPs, which is substantial.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, where do you go from there if the SNP are sitting again on the fence saying, well, we don't want to rock the boat? You saw it as a plebiscite. We didn't quite see it that way because we still favour a referendum. It all becomes very muddy and confusing for people, don't you think?
Well, I think it'd be very difficult for the SNP, if Alba get our people back and we say that we're prepared to support an independence-led government that we actually want to put in, am I going to, get into a situation where John Swinney would rather work with Anna Sarwar than work with the Alba party, whether led by me or Ash Regan? I find that inconceivable. I don't think SNP members would accept that. I don't think many of the SNP members, and I'm had 40 odd good years in the SNP. I've still got friends within it. I wish you'd come and join me, but they haven't. But I can't for the life of me see why SNP members would tolerate a situation where, when we need independence more than ever, you would allow an SNP administration to say, actually, we've decided to do a deal with Labour. Or
could it be reform?
Well, I would hope not. As far as reform is beyond the pale. It's not so much their immigration policies. This is a party that wishes to privatise the NHS, wishes to make the super rich even richer, and wishes to undermine the terms and conditions of those who are the poorest in our society and the poorest in employment. So, Mr. Tyson, Mr. Farage are there for the oligarchs, the Elon Musks in this country and elsewhere. We don't represent them even before we get on to the...
They have one big advantage that you don't have. You can't get the coverage. They get automatic coverage.
That's true.
They only have to whistle when somebody turns up on the BBC.
That's but we've gone through that before, John. The BBC hyped Nigel Farage. The BBC and the media hyped, hyped Brexit. All that was done, and they are hyping reform. We know that. This, they were given, significant greater coverage than others. Equally, we are not pursuing the reform vote. We are pursuing the independence vote. We know that a lot of people who are going reform are not going to be persuaded by us. Yeah. Some of them might have voted for us. Some of them might very well have voted, for independence. I don't think that many, but, I do accept that some will have gone that way. But equally, Alba is out to maximise and galvanise the yes movement, because that movement has been dissipated. The hope that existed in areas has been lost, and we need to get that back. And that's why we need to say things can change. They can change in 2026. And not only can they change, they need to change, because we need to ensure that we have an industrial base and that our vulnerable people, all our people, can heat their homes.
I think there's another vulnerability, and it doesn't apply particularly to Alaba, it also applies to the SNP and the independence movement generally, which is that we've now got a president in the United States who's in every sense a loose cannon, but who is sweet on Nigel Farage. You can envisage a situation where he becomes involved in any election in the UK, Scottish or otherwise, urging people that if they don't vote for reform, then he's going to visit upon them all sorts of difficulties. And he'll probably start doing so during the election, if not before, in order to sway. Because they're very good at this. I mean, he got 70 million votes without necessarily being terribly charismatic. They used technology.
I have no doubt they will, and that's why we need to campaign against that. We need to get mobilised and to be an independent country, because the lurch to the right within the UK is coming, and it's coming dangerously. Reform are going to sweep up in much of northern England or whatever else. Equally, I believe that good people can be mobilised. Let's remember that when Donald Trump was first in, the pain that they caused when they separated parents from their children at the borders, he's in his early days of office, but people are going to see just how nasty it is. And I think that will change a lot of minds of people who have been prepared to see Trump elected, who are prepared to welcome Trump in some ways. And I'll be quite frank, we'd never have voted for Trump, but I never supported Biden or Kamala Harris because of the war machine. They brought it upon themselves. Those who were waging war in Gaza, those who were, impoverishing things, they created the opportunity for Trump. But I think, people will see just how nasty Trump is very soon. And the American economy is not going to be going swimmingly well, except for the super rich. Inflation is rising. If he goes for his tariffs, then that will badly affect the American economy. And, people will begin to realize that things are not as good as they are. And as for Farage having, a great friend in Donald Trump, let's remember what a trade deal with America will be. It's not, by far the worst thing is not going to be chlorinated chicken, but that would be part of it. It will be the undermining and the privatization of the NHS, because Donald Trump will insist that any trade deal with the USA and the UK, which Labour or Tory will sign up to, will finally undermine the NHS. All the privatisation that was brought in a decade or so down south and undermined it will just be put on speed. And that is why we have to oppose that.
Yeah, I mean, it does look very, very difficult. I mean, there was an interesting piece in the New York Times this last weekend there suggesting that the impact of these changes, particularly when it comes to media. I mean, for example, that Trump's press secretary has said, we don't want Associated Press, we don't want any of these, what they call legacy media in the room. You certainly won't get access to the president. We'll let you join in the general press groupings, but you won't have any special access. What we plan to do is to take your seats away and give them to right-wing groups. And I think the intention there is to produce this environment where people are discouraged from protesting. In other words, we've now got a guy who's deputy head of the FBI, who was he ran a blog effectively. Blog. I mean, that guy will have the power to arrest people.
I saw Jeff Bezos is out changing, what the opinion of the Washington Post is going to be.
Yeah.
And, whilst I've never been a huge believer in this great, American free press, the quality of the New York Times, the quality of the Washington Post has been important, even if I disagreed with it on several positions. They were, quality papers, and that is being undermined. I mean, equally, there are good people in America who will speak out, and they have to get organized. And equally, all we can do is look after ourselves and play, the cards that we have. And this is a time for good people to stand up and be counted. And seeking to court reform, seeking to court Trump or Elon Musk is not the way to go. This is a time to say, we have values, we have principles, and we're not prepared to sell them out.
Talking about not selling out principles takes us neatly to Keir Starmer. Has his behaviour in office surprised you?
In many ways, yes. I mean, I was never, I remember sitting up the naughty corner where I used to get put, Mr. chatting away to Jeremy Corbyn or George Galloway or whatever, and looking at the quality and standard of who the Labour ministers were that were coming in. And I always thought that Labour would struggle to have a honeymoon period, but I thought they would have a honeymoon period, even if it would be a lot shorter than previous administrations. I didn't expect them to have virtually no honeymoon period, because they would come in with such catastrophic decisions as the winter fuel allowance, two-child policy, all of these things. So I never had high expectations of Keir Starmer, but I have to say he has been far, far worse than I could ever have imagined. And why so many Labour new MPs are so supine, they cannot believe that things are going to change. It's just not going to happen. And I know the, campaign group, and I speak to some people who are still in the campaign group. I'm bitterly disappointed in them. I mean, they've allowed them to be splitting off. Sultana and others are still out, but McDonald, Ian Byrne are allowed back in. There's no way. They're just going to be picked off one by one. So the idea that the left of Labour's just biding its time to come back ain't going to happen. Those that have come in are just supine. They are just becoming totally reflective of the, Biden and Kamala Harris's Democrats. And where that's heading, where people see that they have no real difference between them and the Tories, people will vote for reform.
That's a very sad thing you've just said there. I mean, if we'd had this conversation 3 or 4 years ago, and I doubt if that would even have crossed your mind that people who used to vote Labour might be interested in voting for reform. And your reason for saying that is because they're just so desperate and they've lost complete confidence in what's on offer.
You saw that in 2019 when you had the blue wall that went up, and Boris Johnson started winning in places in County Durham and other places that I would never ever have expected to be that I would have viewed as part and parcel as the Scottish coalfields and the Northeast coalfields. But they voted Tory for Johnson. And I can understand it's not racism and action against migration. That's what people are focusing on. That's the soundbite. But what they're voting, for is that they are seeing the quality of their education system go down, the health service fail, potholes increase, no future for their kids, and they're just voting against the established political elite, Tory or Labour. Reform come along and say, we're not really the political party. We're the new kids on the block. We're not the old political parties. They don't look at the underlying policies, privatisation of the NHS, making the super rich ever richer. And so it's not a vote for reform. It's not a vote for action on migration in many ways. That gets put forward. It's a vote against a political system that has let these people down. And I've gone around, especially when I was down in London, around places like Birmingham. I mean, you can understand why people are frustrated. And I always remember speaking to my friend Paul Laverty, who wrote, the movie, the Royal Oak, or the Big Oak Watch with Ken Loach, set in northeast of England. The tales he was telling me, about people being moved out of London, because people come in and buy houses, online with cash, and then they move people who are getting kicked out of housing in London, either because they've been antisocial tenants or they just can't afford the rent, and they get dumped in welfare places up in the former pit villages. And you can understand why these people are not voting and not engaging. They're anti-immigrant. The locals suddenly see their community devastated, so they blame the political establishment, which is Labour. So this isn't, as I say, a vote for reform. This is a vote against, what you would say is neoliberalism, which we have had, now since 1979, and people are just saying this ain't delivering for us.
But how how do you compete with that? Because we talked about the fact that the BBC and the mass media generally favour the so-called underdog, and they see reform as an easy way of getting eyes and ears. How do you compete with that?
Well, we've got to do what we did in 2014. I was chatting away over a coffee because I was out leafleting in Broxburn earlier and reminiscing because I've been driving around bits of Edinburgh. I remember, I was driving around Craig Miller, that I know very well because I went in to see people I used to work in the voluntary sector there. And, change in that area as there was hope. Running into 2014, and I still saw some fraying yes figures. There was hope in that area. 70% of Craig, we got a yes vote of 70% in Craig Miller. Yeah. 70%. People were turning out, queuing to vote. People were getting piped to the polling station. People had hope. Nobody expected, if you go on media access and power and control, we would have never have come so close to 45%. Not at all. Because, we faced the weight of the British establishment. We faced President Obama tweeting against us. Yeah. We faced Tony Abbott Tony Abbott, never mind, Guterres, whatever his name was, not Guterres, the other one, from Portugal. And we faced big business, and we nearly did it. And that's why we go again. And how did we do it? We did it by the grassroots. We did it by building up. And that has been the problem. And that is why I have no sympathy for Nicola Sturgeon. The worst thing she did, it's not what she did in office, and there's issues there with the GRR and Isla Bryson. The worst thing she did was to demotivate and ultimately crush the yes movement. It still exists. We have good yes groups, but we're fragmented. They're aging with their lows in numbers. We need to get that back. And what they need is hope, vision, excitement, energy. It won't come easily, but it can come, because the alternative of just waiting on some delivery from the political machine, a political machine that has been in charge now for 10 years in Scotland and has failed to act on mandates and has actually failed to deliver hope for the yes movement.
So where's the hope going to come from? I mean, you're campaigning, but the Scottish government seems to be taking a back seat. It seems to be fairly content. I think it was Leslie Riddoch who says that the government is quite happy to work within the little cage that Westminster has assembled for it, and wants to do its best to keep the cage clean and paint the rungs and all the rest of that stuff, but it's not prepared to leave the cage. So how do you deal with that?
It's really quite sad how, failing to ask even for extended powers, and what they got from Smith of Kelvin was just ridiculous. We have to build this up for the grassroots. The grassroots are still there. Many people have just got fed up and walked away because they weren't, being supported in the marches. People weren't turning up. But the grassroots are still there. We can get that back. We've also got to try and target a new generation. I speak to the youngsters who are mostly the shop stewards. The shop stewards are, not in their 50s or 60s. The shop stewards are in their 20s. They're the ones that we've got to point out, explain to them that the only future And they actually see that. They didn't see the relevance of independence. I now try and persuade them it. But equally, I remember before the last election, them coming back to me to say they were aghast because they were going down to meetings of all the shop stewards from all the refineries in the UK, and they could not believe the number of shop stewards who were saying we're going reform, because they couldn't stomach what Miliband was doing, and they thought that actually reform was their protection against Miliband. So as I say, I think eyes are opening, but what we've got to do is build from the base upwards, because the strength of the Yes movement in 2014 wasn't the outstanding leadership of Alex Salmond, and he was great, and indeed, to be fair, the great efforts that Nicola put in the campaign as well. The strength of the Yes movement was the grassroots. It was, the Artists for Independence. It was the collectives that we had. It was the movements in Loch End. It was the Craig Miller Yes campaign. They weren't actually in the SNP. They sprung up locally.
Yeah.
And we're going to get that
maybe there was two strategic mistakes that were made. I remember speaking to the head of the Yes campaign, and I said, you strike me like a one-club golfer. You're irredeemably positive. And I'm not saying that's a bad thing, but I said you have to have more than one club, because they're going to come at you with negative stuff, and you have to have some response to that. And the response has to be concrete, i.e., if you vote no, the following terrible things are going to happen to you. That's what the No campaign did. They called it Project Fear for a good reason, because they saw that was the Achilles heel. The Achilles heel. The big problem they had was they didn't have the grassroots support. They had the media, they had all the other things that you talked about, but they did not have that. And the way they dealt with that was to use the mass media to be negative. But it seemed to me there was no comparable response on the Yes side to point out the negativity of the union. And if people are looking for a balanced set of circumstances and arguments, and they didn't get that. They said, you guys are just far too positive, and we don't believe you at the end of the day.
I think there's several parts here. I mean, I think, first of all, I always remember Alec arguing that we just peaked a week too soon. The opinion poll that came out on the Friday or Saturday the week before that panicked them, that brought out the vow. Actually, if that hadn't come out, they thought they were winning. And, the problem was they then flung the coach and horses at it, and we got the vow, and that pulled it back. It would have sneaked up on them. As it was, there were steps taken to try and address the kind of negativity. I mean, the polling that was done showed NHS for Yes. That was a critical matter. That's why we moved on to that in the latter part, because people were worried about privatisation. But sometimes, as I was saying, with the context of Alec trying to persuade people in 2021, actually, your second vote SNP is a waste vote. The problem is some people in Scotland just would not believe how bad things would be. I had somebody, after Brexit coming up to me to say what we're going to do about this. Kenny, I knew them. They were a very successful lawyer. Obviously implying it was always my fault. She said, I voted no because I wanted to protect my, EU status. I was like, more fool you, hen. What do you expect me to do now? But people did not believe that they would lie. But they did lie. I mean, on sterling, the pound has crashed.
Kenny, that's the point I'm making. The Yes campaign should have been in the position to say, these people are lying to you, and here's the proof. It's because it didn't have a negative element to it. I know that's distasteful, and I suspect you're thinking, we really don't want to go down that route. But the reality is that's what gets to people. And they had that unrelenting negative propaganda prior to the actual vote itself. And I agree with you. I think that the vow did create sufficient of a movement to nullify a positive outcome. But that in itself, I thought, was a strategic mistake. In other words, the arrangements are sufficiently loose to enable the opposition at the last minute to change the rules. The rules were, it's either one or it was binary. You either vote yes or you vote no. What they did, they introduced a middle position. That should have been illegal. That should have been impossible. Had there been some form of international or some other form of supervision, that vow would not have been possible.
I mean, I don't beat myself up or criticise. I have criticised, Yes Scotland. I thought there was too much emphasis on titles and fancy jobs, and we should be more in the grassroots. Equally, I'm just remarkably proud of the campaign that was run. I think we were right to keep it positive. It was that drove people out. I do also remember, and I think, yes, that's why we went for NHS. Yes, that was, that's what people knew and were worried about. And that was the kind of negative aspect that we played on in babies, before bombs. But I think keeping it positive was right. But I think it's hard to imagine, I always used to, believe we would win. That's why I took it bad and became so close. Because I always remember making speeches during the campaign. I always used to try and make it light-hearted. I would say, look, I used to tell them, my parents used to hate, Ted Heath. Hated Ted Heath, the miners' strike in 72. And, Ted Heath was, and all of a sudden along comes Thatcher. And Ted Heath became this good old spud. Ted was the unofficial leader of the opposition. We liked Ted Heath. And along came Thatcher. And then Thatcher goes, and in comes John Major, and things that Thatcher wouldn't have done, John Major did. And then we got Cameron. And I was actually staying there and saying, what do you think is going to happen next? Cameron will come in. Who will be Prime Minister? Boris Johnson. And everybody go, no, it'll never be Boris Johnson. Oh, yes, it is. But, I have to say, if you'd said to me, how bad will it be, if it's a no vote? Yep. I thought it would be bad. But I never, ever thought it would be as bad as this. I never saw, Brexit.
Kenny, I went to a play with Alan Bissett before the vote, and he outlined in graphic detail exactly what would happen if there was a no vote. And I thought at that time, if the Yes campaign just had the wit to say, let's take what he just said there and put that on notice boards, it would have been a conclusive yes.
Well, I had a play, Alan.
What he said was, if you vote no, you give them the mandate to do the following things to you. And it was gruesome. It was truly gruesome. But I thought that's what was needed. And it didn't happen.
I'm still challenged. I think, the problem, and I actually agree with Colin Fox and the SSP in this. The reason we lost wasn't that, that we went negative enough. The reason we lost, we didn't get a big enough turnout of those that supported. I said earlier, we got 70% in Craigmillar. It was probably a 55% turnout. We got hammered in Duddingston Village, and it was probably an 80% turnout. What we had to do was to get the vote in, Craigmillar up to 65, 70%. That would have come in a second referendum. I have no doubt. People would have, once bitten, twice shy, but a second referendum isn't coming, which is why you've got to go for the plebiscite election.
Yeah.
And your whole lesson from Canada was the turnout in the second referendum when, the sovereigntists came within, a hair's breadth, what was it, 60, 80,000 votes of actually winning. The turnout was over 90%. The turnout, it was higher than any election we'd ever had in Holyrood, but it wasn't high enough. And although we turned out the vote in Craigmillar and places like that, we didn't get the turnout high enough in these areas. Whether we could have done more, again, I don't beat ourselves up. I think we did a good job.
I agree with that. I'm just saying there was a certain naivety that didn't quite understand how the other guy was going to react when he found it he had gone a couple of goals down.
I think,
and that should be built in.
I think we also got to remember we never expected them to lie so brazenly. And I think Alec never really spoke about this, but I did chat, because people criticised Alec for the position on the currency. And it's I think we've learned lessons now. But actually, the position on the currency was that we never expected the British to lie. And yet they did. That is what they did, because everybody knows we could have used the pound sterling. Mark Carney said it afterwards. I say he's now running for the leadership of the Liberals in Canada. I own that. But, Carney was put out there by McPherson, by Osborne, and lied. And let me tell you this great wee story, because I always remember this during the referendum. It was in about July. I was running late and I jumped into a taxi down Portobello. I was going back to someplace, another meeting. And the taxi driver recognised me. He says, Kenny, how's the referendum going? And I says, it's going fine. And I says, what are you making of it? He says, well, I'm decided, I'm voting yes. And I says, that's good. Why'd you do that? He says, so I'll tell you why. I said, I picked up this little Chinese gentleman, he said, at the railway station. And I got the fare and he said, take me to the Caledonian Hotel. And he said to me, driver, what do you make of the referendum? And the driver said, well, my heart says yes, but my head says no. And the Chinese gentleman said, driver, why does your head say no? And he says, well, it's the currency and the economy. And he said, driver, let me tell you, I'm here to see your cabinet ministers. We've got billions to invest, and we will be investing whether you vote yes or no. Our money's here to invest. And he said, on the currency, let me tell you, I've just been golfing with Mervyn King, and the driver was astute enough to remember Mervyn King. I've heard of him. He said, I was speaking to Mervyn about the Scots and their pound, and Mervyn said, if the Scots want a pound, they can have a thistle on it, implying that we need it. And I remember going back and checking and speaking to Nicola and Alec, and we were having a function up at the castle for the Chinese and State Investment Bank. This guy was the real deal, and he was basically saying you can have the pound. Mervyn King was saying you can have a thistle on it, and Carney was put out to lie and say you cannot have it. And of course, it was too difficult to say, well, we can have it. They can't stop us not doing it. They had said no. So that was probably perhaps naivety on our part. We never expected them to lie so spectacularly, and lie they did. And I hope Carney hangs his head in shame.
Well, it's the nature of the beast, I'm afraid. When you come down to cases, people put their careers ahead of morality. It's not unusual. I have to say, every independence movement I ever studied, the same sort of process took place, which is why I raised the point about naivety. I think studying other situations would have shown that this is exactly what you should have expected. If there's the slightest semblance of a yes lead, then the rules would get changed, and that's essentially what happened. But anyway, that's in the past. Look into the future. Let me ask you this question, and I know it's impossible to answer, but I'm going to ask it anyway. If you had to look down the road 5 years ahead, describe Scotland.
Well, it depends what happens in 2026. If we go for it, we push for it. The UK is rocking. The Britain that we know is tearing itself apart. And, as with other nations that have come out of the Greater British Empire, Britain's difficulties are our opportunity. And that is why I am champing at the bit that we have been sitting waiting for 10 years. When I was an SNP Member of Parliament, I remember being elected in 2019 and pushing for a convention. And Nicola Sturgeon comes out in February and says there will be a convention. We never had a convention. We haven't pushed for it. So if we go for it, then we can get it. But we've got to go for it. We've got to mean it. We've got to have leadership. It's the same as Grangemouth. If you have a leadership that says, woe is us, what a disaster. Well, we'll do our best to mitigate the disaster that's befallen us. Then you're not going to, get people on. You have got to show leadership. So we can do it, but we've got to go into this election saying, we've got to get out of this country. We've got to make this a mandate for independence, and we've got to make people realise, what does it mean? It means you can turn your heating on. Businesses can locate there, because it's not, we do tend to concentrate. I was out leafleting today and we were on the council schemes, but, representing East Lothian, it's not all council schemes. There's some very nice areas. But, businesses there are being crucified. I saw a Scottish Government minister out celebrating the opening of a subsea cable that is going from Torness down to the north of England. £2.5 billion going south. And in return, we are getting no revenue. There is no businesses being located nearby because energy is not cheap. There are no jobs coming in. There's been no construction jobs. And any community benefit is, frankly, pennies. It is an insult. So when the Scottish Government say, it's not so bad, we can afford to do without oil, we've got renewables. Where is the renewables? Where are our turbine manufacturers? Where's all the jobs that should be coming? Because youngsters in East Lothian and youngsters in Grangemouth are not getting job opportunities. Every estuary in Scotland should be clanging away, building turbines, manufacturing things for, onshore and offshore renewable energies. And instead, we're importing it from not just the Netherlands or the north of England, we're importing it from Indonesia.
Yeah, it doesn't appear to make a lot of sense. Willie Thompson's raised a good point. He says it was the Treasury and the government, not the Bank of England, that would have decided if Scotland could have continued to use the pound. And what a terrible, terrible, terrible idea that would have been. It would have sunk India within 5 years had we used the pound.
there was a logic to where we came from, in terms of being able to say the day after independence, the only thing that will be changed is Holyrood in charge rather than Westminster. There was no argument on the royal family. Circumstances have changed. We're not going there. There'll be no situation change in the EU. Now we have to change that. So that was then. This is now. That had to get us to victory, and then we would have been able to negotiate. But what we had to do to win.
I think one of the debates we have on this channel from time to time is how campaigning probably needs to change, in the sense that a lot of young people they don't devour newspapers like perhaps you and I did and do, because they don't get information that way. Ironically, a large proportion of them are independent supporters, if the polls are to be believed. And I worry sometimes about how the political parties are reaching that constituency, which doesn't necessarily consume leaflets. It looks to visual media first and foremost, and therefore a dependence on, dare I say it, knocking on doors and leafleting is not going to necessarily reach those folks.
Well, no, I think you make a fair point. I mean, I think it's important, and that's why Shawnee Boy and others coming along, I think, are doing a great job. That's beyond my skills or talents, but we've got the people there who can do that and can get out there. But equally, I'm still a believer in the old-time religion. And it's, twofold. I'm a believer in the old-time religion in the terms it's jobs, health, housing.
Yes.
That's what matters, not concentrating on my identity. I want this. It's a collective, not the individual. And equally, I actually think getting out, hitting doors, being in communities is actually still the way to go. Yep, you can come in on the social media, but you still need to be out there, active in communities. Life has changed post-COVID, but that still matters. And I think that's what we've got to get back, is that old out engaging. Because it's engaging with people and actually engaging on what they want to know. And what they want to know is, what are you going to do? Is my laddie going to get a job? Is my auntie going to get her hip replaced? Is the pothole going to be filled in? Is the school going to be, improving in standards? That's what's needed.
Do you think there'll be an impact, a significant impact in Scotland as the provision of public services in England becomes much, much worse, which seems to be almost inevitable now? I mean, particularly if money is going to get moved out of other budgets to pay for defence. That the reality is that you can either print the money, because that's always an option, but the reality is that the government, Westminster, seems to be determined to move money from one budget or another into defence, and that can only result in people's standard of living falling, because by its very nature, if you don't invest, you don't have the services. Well, do you see an impact there, i.e. that maybe a greater move to reform, or do you see even the slightest possibility that Labour might come to its senses, or do you dismiss that entirely?
I don't see them coming to their senses, because I think they're committed to the increase in military expenditure, and that's taking us into, that will come out of not just the international aid budget that is shameful, but it will come out of public services, the privatisation, the knock-on effect that we get because of Barnett formula. We are not going to be able to, plug every gap. That was never the case. So decline is going to continue, and people will continue to blame the political leadership, and reform will continue to say that they're not the political leadership. They are like J.D. Vance, the opportunity, in fact, will be a disaster.
Yeah. Do you think, just sort of extending that a little bit, if you were First Minister just now, what are the one or two first steps that you would take right now?
Well, I would be in charge. I would be, engaging with the shop stewards. I would be saying that we cannot allow Grangemouth to close, that what we need to do is put a modest bit of investment in to keep it running, because, the knock-on effects will be calamitous. I would be demanding, building up that campaign, supporting it, being seen in the community, seen on the streets, and, preparing for 2026 to say that, this is not just the opportunity to vote for a change in administration, it's an opportunity to actually make sure that we're not deindustrialized as a nation. So what we've got to do is to raise, anger. We've got to, if you cannot make changes, then you've got to say that what is happening to you is wrong. And that's where the Scottish Government has failed. I always remember, Jimmy Reid criticising Scargill, saying it wasn't he was a militant, he was criticising for being, a stupid militant. The criticism was not that we've got an SNP administration. It's the fact that they've not even managed to blame Miliband. They've signed up for Miliband's agenda. And no wonder Unite and the shop stewards basically look at the Scottish Government and say, they're not any better. And actually they haven't been, because I can tell you this story. I got contacted, because of my close involvement with them. When it first broke, they asked for a meeting with the SNP Cabinet Secretary. This was the regional secretary, the Scottish Secretary of Unite, the largest trade union in Scotland, seeking an urgent meeting because the closure of one of the biggest single sites in Scotland of our industrial complex. And he got told he could have half an hour in 3 weeks. As it was, the meeting never took place. I said to him, Derek, that is insulting and it's shameful. I was in the Scottish Government where Alec would have said, you clear the decks. If they can't come in this evening, then you get them in tomorrow. If you can't get them in tomorrow, we meet them at the weekend. Half an hour in 3 weeks. No wonder they've looked at the Scottish Government and said, you went up. And how can you expect the people of Grangemouth to fight if their government accepts that closure is inevitable?
Oh, a very good point to end on, Kenny. I'm very grateful to you. And by the way, before anyone says, accusing me of bias, if Ash would like to come on the show, she's more than welcome. Kenny, thank you very much.
You're very
it's
welcome.
been a pleasure, and it's been educational as well. Thank you again.
Thank you.
Take care. And I hope the meeting goes well at the weekend.
Oh, well, I'm sure it will. Thank you.
Take care. Good night. It's me.